This is kind of the most difficult concept for artists to wrap their heads around. You know, a lot of us are familiar with value, we're familiar with hue. Chroma is a little bit confusing, and a lot of people understand it in terms of temperature, which is one reason why I used the term warm-cool to describe this palette. Even though warm and cool are relative terms, they're less specific. But I think that for this particular set of colors, it does make sense. We can actually mix the oranges towards neutral, and they'll also be moving towards their complement, which is blue. So that kind of works for this particular complementary pair. Tonal value, the darkness or lightness of each area, is the key to painting three-dimensional form. First, I posterized the reference image into 11 value steps. To make it even easier to identify, I assign a color to each value to create what I call a heat map. You can see that my palette is color-coded as well. So this is basically a warm-cool palette. This is just an easy way that I've found to get something very close to a base, kind of useful skin tone mixture. All of the swatches in each column should be approximately the same level of chroma, amount of colorfulness. Each row should be about the same value, about the same level of lightness. And these are the same approximate hue. They're basically orange, just higher in chroma, lower in chroma. If you expose the oil paint to clove oil in a small space, it will keep it from oxidizing and it keeps the paints fresh.
I tape a piece of paper towel that I folded up to the top of the box.
And I take a little bit of the essential oil. This one has a dropper. The other one I just kind of shake out onto the paper towel. I get a little bit in the dropper and I just drop it onto the paper towel and put the lid on, and then it should stay fresh. So in painting these little color studies, they're meant to be very abstract in terms of drawing so that you can really focus completely on the color. So these were all done from life or portrait or figure poses, using a full palette and really just forgetting mostly about drawing. There's just enough to give the composition, and then you really focus on the overall effect of the light and the color that you're seeing. And one reason it's helpful to introduce the idea of abstract shapes and the idea of negative shapes is because we want to be able to conceptualize the structure of the form, but a lot of times what gets in the way of seeing that accurately and really understanding what's going on is that we see it symbolically in our emotional brains, kind of connected to the idea of the features especially. So that's why often the features will grow and get too large for the size of the face, and the face will grow and get too large for the size of the head and the skull, cranium in the back. And then the idea of an eye being almond shaped rather than the actual particular character of the shape of the eye that we see when it's in a particular perspective, in a particular lighting situation, in a particular person. That's why switching back and forth can kind of help break that symbolic tendency. Switching back and forth between seeing shapes as abstract versus conceptualizing the structure. Gamblin burnt sienna, which is also PBR7. Winsor Newton burnt sienna, however, is not PBR7 as it would be traditionally. It's PR101, which is like I said, a red iron oxide. It's synthetically produced. Their burnt sienna is much more chromatic. It's oranger and it's more transparent. They don't use the traditional burnt sienna pigment because these different pigments traditionally were mined from different places, and so they had different color characteristics. Winsor Newton burnt sienna is trying to match the color of the traditional burnt sienna. This is a Utrecht brand. It's their transparent red oxide. It's very close to the Winsor Newton burnt sienna, and it is indeed the same pigment. It's a transparent PR101, so the synthetic red iron oxide. The hair is more naturally dynamic and changeable in a broader way than the face, right? I mean, the face is constrained by the structure, whereas the hair, its structure grows out of the scalp, and that informs the shape of the locks
and the direction of them somewhat, but it's much more changeable, varying. You have to kind of keep it loose, and then at some point you decide, okay, this is how it's going to be. I'm doing kind of an underpainting before even the first pass for the darker areas in the hair. It tends to work better to have a layer that's also a warm dark but transparent, and then put another layer that's semi-transparent over that, and then building up the coverage that way. And the reason I'm using burnt umber is because it dries quickly and it's semi-transparent, so it will kind of retain luminosity in the darks while also allowing me to build up coverage by having an extra layer in there.
You don't have to paint on a really smooth surface. I like a little bit of texture, but I use like a really fine portrait grain, partly because I'm working so small that it, you know, if I have a lot of texture in the canvas, it makes a big difference if it's like a smaller painting than a larger one. It's linen, which is slightly different texture than canvas, which I like a little bit better. But it's just like if you want to like keep pushing and refining it, then at a certain point it gets a little bit difficult on a slightly more textured surface.
So it's very simple. There's no real careful drawing. The proportions can be a little bit off. That's fine. It just needs to be a container to hold the color. And in this case, we're working with very limited color, going kind of in 2 dimensions, just from a little bit of a cool gray to fully chromatic orange. As far as hue, when we think of skin tones, pretty much everyone is going to be between like a reddish orange and a yellow orange. And of course, it will vary in value depending on the person's local skin value, lightness or darkness. The tricky thing about color is the chroma. So that's basically how colorful the color is versus how gray it is. So how dull or how saturated it is. So that's kind of the concept behind the warm cool palette, is you're working with a higher chroma orange and then a lower chroma blue-gray.
So value 5 is both a little bit of darker area of light and also some lighter area of shadow. A lot of times artists will say, oh, well, you can't have areas that are in the shadow be lighter than any area that's in the light. But that's just not true. Sometimes the reflected light can be lighter than areas that are still in the light but turning almost to the shadow. Average chroma for skin will be about 3 to 4, and her shadow averages about a value 2. Value 2, chroma 3, and put just a very simplified version of that shadow in. I'm not painting the eye, I'm just treating it as if it were a very rudimentary clay figure. No detail. There's maybe a hint of an eye socket, maybe a little bump for where the nose is, and then you've got that light on the cheek. I have a piece of Strathmore oil painting paper, and it has a linen finish. I actually use the reverse side, which has a little bit of a more subtle texture than the front side. Even though the pose as a whole is going in this direction, the head itself is tilted off the vertical in the opposite direction. There's something called contrapposto, which is where each mass of the body counterbalances every other mass. So we have the neck is actually tilted in this direction, the chest is tilted in this direction, and then the head. So there's that counterbalance that's happening that gives us a sense of dynamic balance rather than static balance. So it's a balance that allows for growth and movement rather than just sitting there like a pile of bricks. The hairline to the eyebrows is a third, the eyebrows to the bottom of the nose is a third, and then the bottom of the nose to the bottom of the chin is a third. And that's approximate, you know, it's going to be different depending on the perspective of the head, the particular characteristic of the person. The eyes tend to be the halfway point from the top of the head, depending on how poofy the hair is, of course, to the bottom of the chin. Halfway between the bottom of the nose and the bottom of the chin is the bottom of the lower lip. Not the line between the lips, but the bottom of the lower lip. The 2 paintbrush shapes I use most often are round and filbert. A round brush has a cylindrical ferrule, which is this metal part here, and often comes to a point. A filbert brush has a flattened ferrule and is similar to a flat brush, but the tip is curved. The peak of the lash line could come up a little bit there. In this particular portrait, her eyes feel very wide open, probably because she's representing Pandora, and in that myth, she opened the box and bad things happen, so she's got this look of anticipation. Although the expression on her mouth is very peaceful, there's like this imminent surprise or horror that's about to happen. So you can see a little bit more of the top of her iris. Take a value 3, just bring that white of the eye up a little farther. So I've actually just moved, and I'll probably continue to keep rearranging my studio, but for now I have it set up pretty simply to paint and film. I have a pretty small painting, so I have it just set up on a table easel, and it's taped to a piece of foam core along with the reference and my warm cool palette. And then because I'm right-handed, I have my lamp and my camera set up over to the left so that my hand doesn't block the light or the camera angle. And I can actually adjust the color temperature of the lamp, so if I want it to be warmer, I can turn it down to 3200 Kelvin. And if I want it to be cooler, more like daylight, I can turn it up to 5600 Kelvin. So it just gets a little bit oranger or a little bit bluer, kind of similar to my warm cool palette. And then over on the right, I have my iPad for extra reference material, and then my laptop for editing video. I'm looking for how the shadow kind of zigzags down the nose as some of the fuller forms kind of push out and then the narrower forms kind of pinch in a little bit. What's happening with these little zigzags is you have a rounded form and the light's kind of coming maybe from this direction. The form kind of falls into shadow like this, but then because the face is a compound set of forms, so it's a bunch of forms packed together, you might have like another form like this sphere here that also has its own shadow, but then the top form is casting a shadow onto the bottom form. I'm going to start with the eyes. I'm going to go back down to value 3 chroma 3, and I'm going to start to create a little bit of a turn here. High chroma here in the cheek, and then it shifts down to chroma 3 as it turns away from us towards the contour of the jaw and cheek. I'm just trying to create a little bit of movement in the hair. Coming straight down from the corner of her eye, the inner corner, is the wing of the nostril. I'm thinking about where the pupil might be, and I'm trying to really just think abstractly, look at where it lines up here, and try to find those coordinates over on the other side. I don't want to draw in the eye with this method just like straight up. I want to find the landmarks first. From the eyes to the bottom of the nose should be about equal from the bottom of the nose to the bottom of the chin. The bottom of the lower lip should be approximately halfway. On her it looks a tiny bit higher between the bottom of the nose and the bottom of the chin. When we see a greenish color in the skin, it usually means that area has shifted toward yellow in hue and also towards gray or more neutral in chroma. A similar effect happens when we see purplish tones in the skin. It usually means that area has shifted towards red in hue and also again towards gray or neutral in chroma. When we look at these colors against a gray background, we can better see that they are yellow and red in hue. As you're painting them, you see kind of the pathway, the larger pathway of highlights, and you make your brush strokes go across that direction so that you kind of break it up a little bit and it gives a little bit more of a shimmering natural effect. Five eye widths approximately fit across the width of the head. I'm going to start with a limited value study with just values 3 and 7. And then I'm going to paint on top of that with intermediate values.
And that's basically what simultaneous contrast is. Each color will affect our perception of the other color. Instead of starting with black, I'll start with value 1. And as I put that down, to me that looks pure black. You know, surrounded by white, my eyes and my visual system, it's not just the eyes, but the brain, is heightening that contrast, tricking me into thinking that that's pure black. If I then put pure black next to it, if I look very closely, I can tell a difference. But if I'm just glancing at it, they look like the same value, the same dark value.
Light passes through the thin cartilage of the nostril and lights up that dark cave with a warm glow. Just giving you kind of a slightly easier introduction to the painting process, getting used to using the heat map and mixing the grays, which are kind of the foundation of the warm cool palette. before getting into working with the different chromas. And this is what I call a heat map. In this Patreon post, you can download the gradient map file. So we're gonna click on that. Then I've color-coded each of the values, the darks and lights, so that I can more easily tell just with a quick glance which value is which. The white and the burnt umber are Winsor Newton Artisan brand water mixable oil. This is gonna be just as if it were a grisaille. Sometimes it's called a brunei when you have a brown instead of a black or gray. It's gonna be closed, so I'm gonna be using the white to bring up the lights instead of transparency. One of the reasons the heat map is so helpful is that when we see these bright highlights in the reference, we might be tempted to use a lighter gray or even a white to paint them. But the heat map kind of keeps us on track, and we realize that we're seeing contrast, but the actual value change doesn't get that light because it's starting out so dark.
What's the difference between chroma and saturation? They both refer to whether a color is more intense or less intense. We can lower the chroma of a color with black, white, or gray. But lowering saturation basically means adding white. So gray works as well because it contains white, but black will only lower the brightness, not the saturation. If you're an oil painter, you might use the terms interchangeably. But if you're working digitally, it's important to know that when you lower the saturation, the color will also get lighter, so you'll need to lower the brightness as well to stay at the same value.
For this portrait of my mom, I mixed up the 6 basic skin tones with burnt umber, ultramarine blue, cadmium red, cadmium yellow light, and titanium white. I also found 2 colors for the eyes, a dark brown for the iris, and then a warm gray, dark warm gray for the white of the eye. But when I remix these, so this is burnt umber, but I actually remixed them using transparent red oxide, which is what I normally do nowadays because burnt umber dries up so quickly. So when you're doing pre-mixtures, they just like dry up so quickly. So anyway, I just tried this out and it's still really workable, so that's nice. So this is basically a warm cool palette. This is just an easy way that I've found to get something very close to a base kind of useful skin tone mixture. I like to mix out more values, so I'll mix out do pre-mixtures for all the in-between values and more what we would call the different chromas. But you can also do that with the brush as well. So as you're painting, if you don't want to have a ton of pre-mixtures, you can mix them up with the brush. This far I have painted the eye with the warm cool palette. I have my alizarin string, but I've also mixed up a string of pink tones that are kind of in between the alizarin and some of these flesh mixtures. And what I want to do in the second pass of the painting is bring out some of the pinks in the skin tones a little bit more.